What if the Cuban Missile Crisis escalated to nuclear war? Part 1. The Minute of Madness and the Great Fire. Chapter 1. The Red Telephone That Never Rang. We are often told that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the ultimate triumph of diplomacy, a moment where two rational men, Kennedy and Khrushchev, looked into the abyss and blinked. We've grown up with the comfort of knowing the red telephone worked, that the secret deals were struck, and that the world was allowed to continue its path into the future. But what if that narrative of rationality was just a fragile, thin layer of luck? What if the brinkmanship of 1962 didn't end with a handshake, but with a heartbeat of hesitation that cost us the world? Imagine the scene on October 27, 1962. History remembers it as Black Saturday. In our present reality, it was the day the tension peaked and then broke. But in this timeline, the break wasn't toward peace, it was toward the flash. Off the coast of Cuba, the Soviet submarine B-59 is submerged, surrounded by American destroyers dropping signaling depth charges. The crew is exhausted, the air is thick with carbon dioxide, and they are out of contact with Moscow. The captain, convinced that the Third World War has already begun, orders the launch of the ship's tactical nuclear torpedo. In our world, a man named Vasily Arkhipov refused to give his consent, single-handedly saving civilization. In this reality, Arkhipov is not on that submarine. The order is confirmed. The torpedo is fired. That single underwater explosion against the hull of an American destroyer is the spark that lights the global tinderbox. There are no more phone calls. There are no more telegrams. Within minutes, the tactical exchange in the Caribbean escalates to the strategic level. In the silos of Montana and the bunkers of the Ural Mountains, the keys are turned. The nuclear peace we've enjoyed for decades is incinerated in a single minute of madness. If you're like most people, you've looked at the old photographs of that era and felt a sense of distant tension, but you've never had to imagine the reality of those missiles actually leaving their silos. We are about to walk through the hours where history stopped and the Age of Ash began. Chapter 2. The Counterforce Strike and the Horizon of Light. The first hour of a global nuclear exchange in the mid-20th century wouldn't look like the instant, total vaporization we often see in movies. It would be a series of rolling, thunderous waves. The initial military doctrine of both the US and the USSR was counterforce, the attempt to destroy the enemy's weapons before they could be launched. This meant that the first targets weren't the teeming streets of New York or Moscow, but the isolated plains, the mountain bases, and the naval ports. But in the 1960s, nuclear weapons were not the precision instruments we imagine today. They were massive, dirty, and devastatingly powerful. Imagine standing on a farmhouse porch in the American Midwest or a village in the Russian steppe. The sky suddenly turns a brilliant, blinding white, not once, but a dozen times across the horizon. These are the ground bursts hitting the missile silos. The Earth itself begins to scream as the crust is shattered by multi-megaton strikes. The relatability effect here is terrifying. This wasn't a war fought in a distant land, but a war that reached into the very soil people used to grow their food. Within 30 minutes, the communication grids of the Northern Hemisphere are fried by electromagnetic pulses. The radio goes silent. The lights flicker and die. The world as we know it today effectively ends before most people even realize the war has started. As the military targets are obliterated, the second wave begins, counter-value. This is the clinical term for the destruction of cities. In this timeline, the command structures of both nations are shattered so quickly that there is no one left to say stop. The automated launch sequences continue. The great symbols of human achievement, the cathedrals of Europe, the skyscrapers of Manhattan, the historic squares of the Kremlin, are systematically dismantled by firestorms. This is the moment where the emotional anchor of our species is severed. We aren't just losing lives. We are losing the collective memory of our civilization. By the time the sun sets on that first day, the Northern Hemisphere is a graveyard of glowing ruins, and the black rain is beginning to fall. Chapter 3: The Black Rain and the Twilight of the North. The immediate aftermath of the exchange is characterized by a phenomenon that survivors would later call the Great Darkening. As the massive firestorms in the cities consume everything from plastic to asphalt, they pump millions of tons of soot and radioactive debris into the upper atmosphere. In our present reality, we worry about the gradual shift of the climate, but in the weeks following the October exchange, the climate changes in a matter of days. The soot blocks out the sun, and the black rain, a lethal, oily mixture of water and radioactive ash, begins to coat the survivors. For those in the north who survive the initial blasts, the struggle for life becomes a horror beyond description. There are no hospitals, no emergency services, and no food chains. The social order collapses instantly. The relatability of a modern life, with its supermarkets and internet, is replaced by a desperate, primitive scramble for shelter that can block the radiation. People who were doctors, lawyers, and teachers the day before are now scavengers in a landscape of gray ash and permanent twilight. The Northern Hemisphere, the cradle of the industrial world, is effectively removed from the map. But as the North dies, the rest of the planet watches in a state of paralyzed shock. The radiation and the soot don't respect borders. The prevailing winds begin to carry the age of ash toward the Southern Hemisphere. Nations like Brazil, Australia, and South Africa, which were bystanders in the Cold War, suddenly realize they are the last guardians of the human flame. They are forced to watch as the sky turns a bruised, sickly purple and the temperature begins to plummet. The global catastrophe is no longer a headline. It is the air they breathe. We are entering a world where the very concept of a nation is being rewritten by the necessity of survival in a dying biosphere. Chapter 4: The Southern Stand. While the North is a landscape of fire and ash, the Southern Hemisphere becomes a chaotic refuge. In our history, the global South was often seen as the periphery of power. In this timeline, it becomes the center of the world by default. But this is not a peaceful transition. Imagine the panic in cities like Sydney, Buenos Aires, or Cape Town as the first refugees from the northern naval fleets begin to arrive. Ships filled with dying sailors and terrified civilians, carrying news of the total annihilation of the old world. The governments of the South are faced with an impossible choice. Do they open their doors to the millions fleeing the radioactive North, risking the collapse of their own fragile resources? Or do they close their borders and watch the rest of humanity perish? The high stakes of this era are not about ideologies or borders. They are about the carrying capacity of a planet that is rapidly cooling. The Southern Stand is the beginning of a new, darker chapter of human history, a time where the light of the old world has gone out, and the survivors are left to huddle around the last remaining embers in a world that is growing colder by the hour. Part 2: The Great Freeze and the Subterranean Society. Chapter 5: The Year Without a Summer. In our present reality, we often take the seasons for granted: the inevitable return of spring, the warmth of a summer sun, and the reliable rhythm of the harvest. But in the months following the Great Fire of October, that fundamental contract with nature was torn to shreds. The millions of tons of soot and pulverized cities injected into the stratosphere didn't just linger. They formed a global shroud, a dark mirror reflecting the sun's life-giving energy back into the void. The nuclear winter was no longer a theoretical model found in the pages of academic journals. It became a physical, bone-chilling reality that redefined the human experience. Within 3 months of the initial exchange, temperatures across the Northern Hemisphere plummeted by as much as 30 degrees Celsius. Imagine a world where the thermometer never rises above freezing, even in the heart of what should have been July. The Great Lakes of North America and the Baltic Sea didn't just skin over with ice. They froze solid, deep enough to support the weight of a tank. The agriculture that once fed billions simply vanished. In the first year, there was no harvest. In the second, the soil itself remained locked beneath a layer of permafrost that refused to melt. This was the Great Freeze, a period where the planet's entire biosphere went into a state of shocked hibernation. The relatability effect hits home when you realize that in this timeline, the simple act of seeing a blue sky became a legendary story, a myth told by elders to children who have only ever known a leaden, purple twilight. Chapter 6: The Concrete Coffin. While the surface of the North became a frozen graveyard, the story of humanity retreated into the shadows. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had spent the better part of a decade preparing for this possibility, carving vast networks of bunkers into the bedrock for their political and military elites. But for the average person, the concrete coffin became the only hope for survival. In the frantic weeks following the missiles, those who survived the firestorms and the black rain began to crawl into the earth. Subways, salt mines, and reinforced basements became the new centers of a fragmented civilization. Life in these subterranean shelters is a test of the human spirit that is almost impossible to grasp in our current day and age. Space is the most valuable currency, more precious than gold or fuel. Families are crammed into narrow concrete corridors, living under the constant, artificial hum of air filtration systems that represent the thin line between life and suffocation. The lack of natural light leads to a physical and psychological wasting. Skin becomes translucent and thin, and the mind struggles to maintain a sense of time without the rising and setting of the sun. These are the buried generations. They have created a culture built on the necessity of total silence and the fanatical recycling of every scrap of plastic or metal. Every heartbeat in the bunker is a calculated cost, and every failure of a water pump is a potential death sentence for thousands. Chapter 7: The Southern Shield. As the North froze, the Southern Hemisphere found itself in a paradoxical position. Nations like Brazil, Australia, and New Zealand were suddenly the de facto leaders of the human race, simply by virtue of being far enough away from the primary targets. But this was not a golden age of Southern dominance. It was a state of siege. As the remnants of the Northern naval fleets, carrying the last organized military forces and millions of terrified, radioactive refugees, began to appear on the horizon, the Southern Shield was forged. The governments of the South faced an agonizing moral dilemma. Do they open their ports to the survivors of the Old World, risking the total collapse of their own fragile resources and the introduction of radioactive plague? Or do they close their borders and watch the rest of humanity perish in the cold? In cities like Sydney and Rio de Janeiro, the atmosphere was electric with dread. The high stakes of this era were not about ideologies or borders, but about the carrying capacity of a dying planet. In many cases, the Southern Wall was literal, minefields and naval blockades designed to keep the starving masses of the North at bay. The Southern Hemisphere became a lifeboat that was already dangerously full, and the decisions made in those coastal command centers would haunt the survivors for centuries. Chapter 8: The Silence of the Waves. In the world as we know it today, we are used to a planet that is instantly and constantly connected, a web of global shipping, underwater data cables, and nonstop trade. But in the decade following the crisis, a profound silence of the waves set in. The vast merchant fleets that once carried the lifeblood of the global economy were either at the bottom of the ocean or rotting in ports that had been turned to ash. International trade didn't just slow down, it ceased to exist. The loss of this global grid meant that technology began to regress at a terrifying speed. Without the specialized parts produced in northern factories that no longer existed, the machines of the South began to fail. Tractors broke down and were replaced by oxen. Electrical grids failed and were replaced by candlelight. The Internet, which in our timeline was just a germ of an idea in a military lab, was never born. The world became a series of disconnected islands of survival, linked only by high-frequency radio pulses that were often lost in the magnetic interference of the cooling atmosphere. This was the true global catastrophe, the death of the connection between peoples, turning the planet into a collection of lonely, frightened outposts. Chapter 9. The Psychology of the Twilight. What does it do to the human mind to live in a world where the future has been canceled? The emotional anchor for the survivors of this era was a deep, pervasive sense of data fatigue and spiritual exhaustion. In the bunkers and the southern colonies alike, a new kind of fatalism took root. People stopped planning for years and started planning for hours. The pattern breaks of daily life, the festivals, the celebrations, the milestones, were replaced by the grim routine of survival. Religions began to shift, with many new sects emerging that viewed the Great Fire as a purging of a sinful industrial age. Others fell into a deep nihilism, convinced that the Earth was simply finishing the job the missile started. Yet, even in the dark, the human instinct for relatability survived. People still told stories, they still sang songs in the bunkers, and they still looked at the gray, clouded sky with a faint, irrational hope that one day the sun might break through. It is this thin thread of hope, the refusal to simply lie down and die in the ash, that would define the next 50 years of human history. Part 3. The Age of the Ash Warlords and the Brutal Green. Chapter 10. The First Surface Expeditions. By the mid-1970s, the Great Freeze had begun to settle into a predictable, albeit lethal, equilibrium. In the deep bunkers of the Northern Hemisphere, the first generation born entirely underground was reaching adulthood. To them, the blue sky was a fairy tale, and the sun was a mathematical concept rather than a felt warmth. But the resources in the concrete vaults were beginning to fail. Spare parts for air recyclers were exhausted. The hydroponic gardens were failing due to nutrient depletion. The buried generations faced a choice: die in the dark or risk the light. The first surface expeditions of the 1970s were not the triumphant returns seen in science fiction. They were desperate, terrifying forays into a landscape that looked like another planet. Imagine stepping out of a lead-lined airlock into the ruins of what used to be Chicago or Berlin. There is no sound. The wind doesn't whistle through trees. It rattles through the hollow rib cages of rusted skyscrapers. The relatability effect here is found in the objects the scouts found: a child's tricycle frozen in a block of gray ice, or a billboard for a vacation spot that no longer existed. These explorers weren't just searching for scrap metal. They were searching for the remains of their own identity. Chapter 11. The Rise of the Ash Warlords. As these bunker groups emerged, they found they were not alone. Not everyone had made it into the government vaults. In the fringe zones, the mountains, the deep forests, and the outskirts of the scorched cities, survivors had persisted. But these were not the organized citizens of the old world. These were the Ash Warlords. In the power vacuum left by the collapse of the United States and the Soviet Union, strength became the only law. In the ruins of Europe and North America, a new kind of feudalism emerged. These warlords didn't fight over ideology. They fought over clean zones, pockets of land where the radiation had subsided enough for stunted crops to grow. Imagine a warlord's fortress built into the remains of a highway cloverleaf or a decimated football stadium. Their armies were scavengers, armed with pre-war relics and primitive spears. This is the high-stakes reality of the 1980s, a world where the dream of democracy had been replaced by the brutal necessity of the strongman. The emotional anchor for the people under these regimes was a crushing sense of relief mixed with terror. They were safe from the cold, but they were slaves to the sword. Chapter 12. The Cult of the Great Cleansing. In the absence of the old social structures, the human mind sought meaning in the madness. By the 1980s, a powerful new religious movement had swept across both hemispheres, the Church of the Great Cleansing. To these believers, the nuclear fire of 1962 was not a mistake of man, but a divine intervention. They preached that the old world of consumerism, greed, and technology had to be incinerated so that a pure humanity could be reborn in the ash. This wasn't just a peaceful faith. In the ruins, the cleansers became a fanatical force. They viewed pre-war technology as heresy. If a bunker group emerged with a working generator or a radio, the cleansers would often attack, not to steal the technology, but to destroy it. They believed that the longer humanity clung to the ghost of the past, the longer the sun would stay hidden. This created a tragic pattern break in the recovery of the species. Just as humanity began to gather the tools to rebuild, a spiritual war broke out that threatened to extinguish the last sparks of industrial knowledge. Chapter 13. The Brutal Recovery of Nature. While humanity fought over ruins and gods, something remarkable was happening in the radioactive dead zones. We often think of radiation as a total extinguisher of life, but in this timeline, the absence of humans proved to be a more powerful force than the presence of fallout. By the 1980s, the brutal green had begun to take over. Without the constant pressure of industry, farming, and urban expansion, the forests returned with a vengeance, but they were different. Imagine a forest where the leaves are a dark, sickly indigo instead of green, adapted to catch the faint ultraviolet light that pierced the soot-choked sky. The animals that survived the Great Freeze had undergone generations of rapid, brutal evolution. Predators like the ash wolf or the vault rat were larger, more aggressive, and perfectly camouflaged for a world of gray and white. Nature was reclaiming the planet, but it was a nature that was hostile to its former masters. The relatability effect. Here is the realization that the Earth didn't need us to recover. It simply waited for us to get out of the way. The cities weren't just ruins. They were becoming the foundations of a new, mutated wilderness. Chapter 14. The Southern Paradox and the Northern Ghost. By the end of the 1980s, the gap between the two halves of the world had become an unbridgeable chasm. In the Southern Hemisphere, a version of the old world still flickered. Nations like Australia and Brazil maintained a level of technology that felt like a memory of the 1950s. They had electricity, some shipping, and organized governments. But in the north, there was only the ghost. The radio signals from the bunkers grew fewer every year. The ash warlords and the cleansers were the only voices left on the airwaves. This southern paradox was the realization that while they were the civilized ones, they were also the most stagnant. They were so focused on preserving what they had that they stopped innovating. In the north, however, the brutal pressure of the environment was forcing a new, hard kind of human development. As we look at the transition into the modern era, the question wasn't if the South would save the North, but if the new humans of the North would eventually come for the South. The peace of the Southern Hemisphere was built on the assumption that the North was dead, but in the radioactive shadows of the 1980s, the North was merely being reborn in fire and ice. Part 4. The Iron Stagnation and the Neostates. Chapter 15. The Digital Fossil. In our present reality, we define our era by the flow of information, the invisible web of satellites and silicon that connects every human being on the planet. But in the world that followed the Great Fire, the information age died in its infancy. The massive electromagnetic pulses of the 1960s exchange didn't just fry the grids of that time. They created a permanent instability in the upper atmosphere that made long-range wireless communication a chaotic gamble. As a result, the Silicon Revolution that defines our current day and age never occurred. Imagine a world where computers remained massive, vacuum tube-powered relics, housed in lead-shielded bunkers. There is no internet, no global positioning, and no digital memory. Technology became a fossil, something to be excavated from the ruins and kept running through sheer mechanical will. The relatability effect. Here is the profound isolation of the individual. In this world, if you leave your village or your bunker, you are truly off the grid. The world has become massive and mysterious again, a collection of lonely outposts linked by copper wires and horse-mounted messengers. Knowledge is not a click away. It is a physical object, a book, a map, or a hand-drawn blueprint that is worth more than its weight in gold. Chapter 16. The Rise of the Neo-States. As the decades of the late 20th century passed, the chaotic reign of the Ash warlords began to stabilize into something more permanent. These were the Neo-States, industrial military entities that rose from the cinders of Europe and North America. They didn't claim to be the successors of the old democracies or the Soviet Union. They were entirely new creatures, built on the principles of total resource management and data purity. In these societies, the high stakes are found in the quota, the amount of scrap metal recovered, or the bushels of stunted, radioactive grain produced. One of the largest neo-states, often called the Atlantic Remnant, operates out of the reinforced naval bases of the American East Coast. It is a society where every citizen is a soldier laborer, and the emotional anchor is the collective pride of surviving the unsurvivable. But this stability comes at a brutal price. These states are closed systems, where dissent is seen as a threat to the survival of the species. The dream of individual liberty, which was the heartbeat of the pre-fire world, has been replaced by a fanatical devotion to the grid, the collective effort to keep the lights on for one more night. Chapter 17. The Southern Twilight. While the North forged these hard, new empires, the nations of the Southern Hemisphere entered a period of Southern Twilight. In our history, the late 20th century was a time of rapid growth and cultural explosion. In this timeline, nations like Australia, Brazil, and South Africa became the world's museums. Because they were the only places that remained relatively intact, they became obsessed with preserving the world of the 1950s and 60s. If you were to walk through the streets of a major southern city in this contemporary era, it would feel like a haunting time capsule. The cars, the fashion, and the music are all frozen in the era of the Cuban crisis. There is no new culture because all creative energy is funneled into maintaining the old machines. The South is the guardian of the human flame, but it is a flame that is growing dim. They are running out of the specialized chemicals and parts that only the northern factories used to produce. This creates a unique curiosity tension. The North is rebuilding into something terrifying and new, while the South is slowly fading away, clinging to the ghosts of a world that died in 1962. Chapter 18. The Modern Landscape of the Eternal Winter. As we look at the modern landscape, more than 60 years after the Minute of Madness, we see a planet that has been fundamentally altered. The soot in the atmosphere has thinned enough to let a bruised, purple light reach the surface, but the Earth remains a cold, harsh place. The nuclear winter did not end. It simply became the eternal spring of the ash. The ice caps have expanded, and the great coastal cities of our present reality are either radioactive ruins or half-submerged in frozen harbors. The human population has stabilized at a fraction of its pre-fire peak. Humanity is no longer the master of the planet. We are a scavenger species living in the cracks of a mutated wilderness. The pattern break. Here is the realization that the War of 1962 never truly ended. It just shifted from a conflict between nations to a conflict between humanity and and a hostile environment. We are a species with a profound memory of greatness, living in a reality of scarcity. The skyscrapers of the old world still stand in the distance, jagged teeth of concrete against a leaden sky, serving as a permanent reminder of what happens when the fear of the flash is ignored. Chapter 19. The New Humanity. Perhaps the most significant change in our current day and age is not the climate or the ruins, but the people themselves. The buried generations and the ash warlords have produced a humanity that is fundamentally different from us. They are tougher, more communal, and deeply skeptical of technology and progress. To them, the information age we cherish is seen as the age of arrogance, the time when humanity was so focused on its own voice that it forgot to listen to the silence of the abyss. In this world, the most important skill is not coding or finance, but the ability to repair a 1950s generator or identify which mutated plants are safe to eat. The relatability of their lives is found in the small victories: a successful radio contact with a distant bunker, the birth of a healthy child, or the rare sight of a clear, starry night through a gap in the clouds. This is the world that was born on Black Saturday, a world of ash, iron, and an unbreakable will to endure. Part 5. The Mirror of History and the Final Choice. Chapter 20. The Silent Sentinels of the Old World. In our present reality, the ruins of the mid-20th century are often seen as monuments to progress. Old factories turned into lofts, or bunkers turned into museums. But in the contemporary era of this alternate timeline, the ruins are silent sentinels. They are a permanent part of the landscape, jagged teeth of rusted steel and scorched concrete that dominate the horizon of every major northern territory. For the people living in the shadow of these giants, there is no before and after. There is only the eternal present of survival. The most profound emotional anchor for this generation is the realization that they are living in the wreckage of a titan. Imagine walking through the skeletal remains of a city like Paris or Washington, D.C. The structures are still there, but they have been hollowed out by fire and reclaimed by the brutal green. This creates a unique psychological state, a mixture of deep humility and a hard, practical focus on the now. They don't dream of building new skyscrapers. They dream of finding a single working copper pipe or a cache of unruined seeds. This is the iron stagnation, a world where humanity has accepted its place as a tenant in the ruins of its own making. Chapter 21. The Choice of Two Evils. As we reflect on this journey through a world of ash, we are forced to confront a disturbing question. In our own timeline, we live with the stability of fear. We exist under the constant, thin threat that one mistake could end everything in a flash of light. It is a heavy burden that has defined our geopolitics for nearly a century. But in the world we've just explored, that flash actually happened. They traded the fear of the end for the reality of a slow, agonizing struggle. They saved the species from total extinction, but at what cost? They live in a world without the internet, without global travel, and without the freedom to choose their own destiny. Their lives are defined by the logic of the bunker, a cold, mathematical existence where every calorie and every breath is monitored by a neo-state. The pattern break. Here is the realization that peace is not just the absence of war. It is the presence of a future. In the world of the Great Fire, the future was canceled in 1962, and humanity has been living in the postscript ever since. Chapter 22. The Echoes in the Ash. The legacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis in this reality is not one of a narrow escape, but of a permanent scar. It serves as a reminder that the nuclear peace we enjoy is a fragile miracle. The relatability effect for us, the viewers in our current day and age, is to look at our own world with new eyes. We see the tensions, the brinkmanship, and the rhetoric, and we realize how thin the line truly is between our comfortable lives and the age of ash. As the soot slowly clears and the first true blue patches of sky begin to appear for the descendants of the survivors, they are not looking back with nostalgia. They are looking forward with a grim determination never to let the old world return. They have built a civilization that is harder, quieter, and more respectful of the Earth's limits. They are a new humanity, born from the fire, who have learned the hardest lesson of all, that the ultimate weapon is not the bomb, but the restraint to never use it. The silence of the northern ruins is their most powerful teacher. Thank you for staying with us through this exploration of a world that almost was. This journey through the Great Fire of 1962 shows us that while humanity is incredibly resilient, the price of our mistakes can be an eternity in the cold. Now, I want to hear from you in the comments, because this is a moral dilemma that has no easy answer. If you were a leader in the Southern Hemisphere during the Great Freeze, facing a dying planet and millions of radioactive refugees at your doorstep, what would you have done? Would you have opened your borders to save what was left of the human race, even if it meant the certain collapse of your own society? Or would you have built a southern wall to ensure that at least one small part of humanity remained stable and pure? Let us know your choice and your reasons in the comments below. The debate starts now.